Hi folks, it's John Nizman from lastchanceautorestore.com. I'd like to share with you, this is the second part of the 1967 Chevrolet Corvette Roadster. So this is a 427 big block. And in our previous video we shared with you when the hood was off of the car. We were talking about the big block and some of the things that we're doing in terms of enhancements with the cooling system and some other things. So now we have the car up on the hoist. I'd like to share with you underneath the pros and cons of what we see. So if we start here at the very front, there's a lot of things that I really do like, and the detail that someone went through. First of all, the steering components and the suspension components in the frame appears to have been sandblasted and powder coated. And as we go down further, I'll share with you how nice the frame looks. The other impressive thing, and I believe the camera can pick it up, might not be too many glares, you can see where they've done quite a bit of research on markings for assembly down the line. And it's something that goes on forever that people will always talk about, like in blogs and do a lot of research, and there's always guys who'll say, well, the lower spindle, it had orange overspray, and someone else will say, well, no, it didn't. And then depending on the factory, the torsion bar in the front, it was all natural, it wasn't coated. And other people say, well, yes, it was. It depends on the factory. Just to share with you, we really like a lot of things that they've done. The one thing, or the most important thing I don't like is the lack of detail in how it was assembled. And we're not really sure, because this car was sold at a few different auctions, and some of them I'd like to point out, high-end car auctions. Some of them that are on, televised and they're promoted heavily. This is one of those cars, and it was staged in such a way that the door had a post to hold it open on the driver's side, so you couldn't see that when the door is shut, it didn't align with the body properly. And then underneath, they had a mirror, but in one location that was kind of pre-selected, which showed the best part of the underside of the chassis. But here at Last Chance Auto Store, we look at everything. It has to be, obviously a pretty car, but it has to be very safe to drive. It has to be reliable and as trouble-free as you can make it. And there's just a lack of attention to detail in quite a few of the areas. But don't get me wrong, a very, very pretty car. So we're just going to take this 67 Corvette Roadster to the next level in terms of what it deserves. So underneath, someone has basically they've gone into a catalog and bought a considerable amount of parts. So our front suspension, our shocks, the coil springs, they are brand new and they look all natural and nice as they should. The steering components, such as the tie rod ends, the steering linkage, it all looks really nice. Our steering damper is new. All of our lines with the upgraded power steering setup looks fairly new. There's some seepage and some leaking that we have to deal with. But overall, in terms of quality, the quality is definitely here. You'll notice in the front we have the correct shims like the factory did. All of the bumper brackets have been sandblasted and repainted, so it looks quite nice. And then as we come back a little further, there's some silly little things that start to happen or become obvious to us. So in terms of steering and engine, when you look at the components, and I think the camera, if it comes from the passenger side looking up, there's a few things that kind of stick out for me that I don't like. And I don't think there'd be a lot of glare. So basically when you come up from the oil pan to the engine block, and as we go up higher, you can see all this staining on the engine block. And the main reason why we have the discoloration and some rust marks, most of that was not having an exhaust manifold gasket, and it was so hot and there was so much blow by that it was burning the paint off of here. And then they also had a fuel leak and the fuel was coming down, and that's why we have the discoloration in the engine block. But it's in a location which is pretty difficult to see, and when the exhaust manifolds are reinstalled, it's going to block most of that. So some guys would say, well, let's pull the motor and transmission and go all gangbusters. I don't think that's probably overkill in this case. It's just something that we make notes of. As we go to the other side, so the driver's side of this engine, and this is the side where we were shocked on a few things. First of all, there's on the engine mount on this side, we've put a bolt in here. So there's 2 bolts at the top, and there's 1 bolt that's supposed to go here at the bottom. When we were doing the first inspection on this car, there was no bolt there, and it had fresh paint in the threads. So this car has never had the 3rd bolt. And being a big block and a torquey engine and a 4-speed manual, that would be something that I'd be quite concerned about. The other thing is we have a lot of the bolts and hardware. I don't understand why. Like you can see here, for example, at part of the steering, they've got the correct yellow marking. So the amount of research that someone did for the assembly marks and paint marks. So we have the yellow on the ends, where I know some people in the Corvette world will say that is exact and accurate. Some people will say the shade of that yellow is off, but you get the idea. The detail that they spent doing the research in the markings on the chassis and throughout, you would think, wow, this is a gorgeous car. But then details like not torquing the bolts properly, a lot of bolts in the suspension were just finger tight. And then missing bolts, you know, is kind of a concern. And when you look at the exhaust manifold not being there, and then you see this sort of thing, the soot. Now I apologize because this side exhaust piece is hanging down a little bit, but I'm sure the camera can pick it up. There's this carbon black strip that comes all the way across, and that is blow-by blowing down from the manifold and where it joins with the exhaust system. So you can see part of it here where the exhaust system was leaking. So where you see all of the black soot all around it, it didn't have a bull ring gasket in that location. So then you're getting this kind of thing. And at one time, this oil pan would have looked gorgeous. So we don't like that sort of stuff. We certainly don't like all the fluid leaking. So you can see pretty much everywhere that I touch, I think the camera can probably pick it up, there's like the power steering pump was leaking and the seal is gone in it, and it runs down the line, it pulls on the control arm, and this control arm is literally full of oil. So somebody has just kept adding power steering fluid to the pump, and it's leaking a lot. So it's all pooled in there, and you can see where there's still droplets coming all the way down the control arm. So that sort of stuff drives us crazy, especially if you're going to show this car. So, you know, we're dealing with that. So we've got the power steering pump removed, and we're going to be replacing it. As we come back further, you can see all of the fittings for the steering. It's also leaking here. So nothing has been tightened properly, and nothing has been torqued. So we're going to recheck all of this, because basically any area that there's seepage, there's a reason why it's leaking and it should not be. So as we come back further, as I mentioned earlier in the other video, this 427 big block engine is numbers matching and correct with this car, which is a really big deal for a 67 Roadster. Same thing with this transmission. The 4-speed manual transmission, all the numbers were checked and verified. They are all matching with this car too, which is really nice. Now as we come back further, we'll see the detail. You can see the floor pans and how nice they are. You can see they have the correct heat shield matting that the factory did that comes around that tunnel. Some people call it a sound deadener, other people call it the heat shield that comes across there. You'll notice the cross member of the frame, it's nice and clean. It's been sandblasted and appears to be powder coated. But once again, at the back, the transmission tailstock seal, it's leaking, and it's leaking a large amount. I believe the camera can probably pick it up. It's a thicker fluid, and there's lots. So it's got quite a few leaks in the back here, which we'll have to address. Now what's strange, and it could be, someone would suggest that perhaps all of these leaks are just from the car sitting. But when you look, probably you can see it from the back side, you can see that that seal appears to be an older seal. So if you're going through the extent you're going to do a total ground up restoration and a body off the frame, you can see where this beautiful drive shaft, this polished drive shaft, is new. You can see that the U-joints are new, and they even went to the extent of painting, marking the drive shaft, but then not replacing that tailstock seal, so you have all of these leaks. So that's kind of discouraging in my opinion. And then as we come back further, you can see how beautiful the pans, and that is correct. There's been a lot of debates about, did General Motors paint the bottom sides of these fiberglass floors, and they did not. This is correct. And then you can see the frame, how beautiful the back section of the frame is, and then we have the factory correct clips. So you can see there's really nice detail work, and I think the camera can pick it up. We have the proper brackets for the parking brake cables. They're almost adjusted properly. And then when you come here, you see the detail, the proper clips that are riveted into place, and the lines look quite nice. So this looks really, really nice, and we like that. And then when you come to the back, you see the parking brake cable has the factory assembly yellow paint marking on this side. And a lot of guys, if they do the research, it's on both parking brake cables. They touched it with yellow to verify that they're fastened and it has the proper clips. And then as you come back further, you'll see they have more markings. So we have, once again, we've got the brand new drive shafts. We have all of the factory paint markings, and everything looks quite nice when you look at it quickly. But then you come back here, and once again, at the rear diff, you can see we have a tremendous amount of fluid leaking again. So it's unfortunate because that looks like, once again, it's an old gasket. So they went ahead and cleaned it, but then didn't pay attention to areas where fluid is going to be leaking. Now there's a couple of disturbing things that we noticed. So our guys were doing a thorough inspection on the car, and when we got to the back, we couldn't understand why there was play in the rear hub. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this setup, basically where the plate and the studs are for the rim to bolt onto. And the back of that, there's a spline, and then it's bolted through an assembly with bearings and spacers. And there's a specific setting and torque spec for that spindle. And there was an excessive amount of play on this right rear wheel. Now most people would say they all have that. The spec on this rear wheel, because people when they drive these cars are more aggressive turning left than they are turning right. So if you imagine we're driving this big block Corvette Roadster, we're going to drive, because we're more confident, we'll be more aggressive turning into a left corner, and that puts more stress on this right rear side. So you would assume that this is going to have a little bit of play in it just because of flexing. But when we checked it, the thread and the castle nut were stripped, and it was just spinning with your finger. And then when we looked at it closer, and this is kind of disturbing, someone has taken this wire, which at first we thought was a spring, and they've taken this wire. They obviously knew that the thread was stripped, and they twirled this wire around the hub, the back of the hub, and compressed it and hoped that this would bind. And you can see how brittle it is. It's literally breaking apart in my hand. and that's kind of scary. So they had this in between, and that's why it's so important. We don't just look at the shiny paint and look at the tires, because folks, this is a gorgeous car. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not picking this car apart and saying, look at how terrible it is. This is an absolutely gorgeous car. You look at the silver paint, the side pipes, the correct wheels, the Firestone period correct red lines. You know, it is beautiful. You come along the back and you can see how clean and nice the spare tire cover is. You don't have any overspray. The detail of the body coming down, they have everything base clear, and it's really, really well done. But then from a safety standpoint or from an enjoyment standpoint, to rely on little pieces of wire between a main thread that holds that back wheel, that's quite discouraging. So when we see that, it makes us feel good that we are very thorough. We remove the wheels, we remove the brake drums if they're a drum brake. In this case, we have disc brakes. We want to take measurements of everything and torque specs on everything, and by doing that, we're certain that this car is going to be safe for our client to drive. So I just wanted to go through, because this is a really special car, and we really enjoy having cars like this at our facility. So once again, this is a really nice Corvette. This is a 1967 Corvette big block Roadster or convertible, 4-speed numbers matching. So as we continue with this, going through it and just making sure everything's right, we'll share with you a couple more videos, because we have an upcoming video that we'd like to share with you. It has a gorgeous Stinger hood, and there's excessive damage to the bottom side of the hood. So because we have the hood off the car now, we'll clearly show you and share with our client how much damage there is there, and then we'll show you how we're going to go about repairing it. So I really appreciate you watching. I'm John from lastchanceautorestore.com.